Alright, let's continue playing around with our GroupBy object. So I'll re-execute all of our code from the previous lesson. And to review, when we create a GroupBy object, we're basically splitting the data in our original data frame. Now, the object that we've created, which is in sectors in this case, is not a data frame. It's really more of a group of data frames that's bundled together in one object. And so in order to do anything with it, we need to call an operation on the actual grouped objects, which is sectors. So let's begin by actually passing sectors into a built-in Python function, which is len. Now normally if we pass a data frame, such as fortune, into len, we're going to get the number of rows. If we pass a GroupBy object into the len function, we're actually going to get the number of groupings. So when I execute this, we'll see that there are 21 unique groupings, or 21 unique sectors, within our sectors GroupBy object. Now how can I prove this? Well, what I can actually do is to extract my sector column, which exists in my original fortune data frame. And you may recall a method called nUnique. That stands for number of unique. And that's going to give me an integer that represents the number of unique values in my sector column. And if I execute this, you'll see that it's the exact same. There's 21 different sectors that are represented throughout these 1,000 companies. And our GroupBy object has basically created a data frame for all 21 of those groupings, all 21 of those sectors, and then just lumped them into our GroupBy object. So how do we extract all this information out? Well, one of the first methods that we can call on a GroupBy object, which is represented in sectors here, is size. Now what size is going to do is give us a series where the index is going to represent the sectors or the groupings, and the values are going to represent the number of rows in each one of those groupings or data frames. So if we take a look, from our original data frame in fortune of 1,000 rows, we've split it up into 21 sectors, as we know, and here they are all represented on the left. And to the right, I have a count of how many rows fall into that grouping. So for the sector aerospace and defense, I have 20 different rows, or 20 different companies that fall under that sector, under that grouping. And similarly for the apparel sector, I have 15 companies that fall underneath that grouping, that data frame that's housed within my GroupBy object. And this hopefully can remind you of a method that we can call on a series, and it's actually the value counts method. If I just scroll down a bit here, and I take my fortune data frame and extract my sector column, what we're seeing above in the size method is very similar to value counts, because what value counts does is give us a count of all of the unique values within our series. And when we talk about grouping, it's basically doing the exact same thing. It's taking those unique values, it's just categorizing them with all the rows that fit them. So if I execute this code, we'll see that we have the exact same values that are up here. The only difference between value counts is that here it's sorted in descending order with the most occurrences first. So financials is going to show up first because it has 139, and proceed downwards to the smallest number of occurrences. In comparison, the size method on a GroupBy object is going to sort alphabetically by the grouping or the label. You can see here that we have them in alphabetical order starting from A. However, the values are going to be the exact same. So for example, financials here has 139 occurrences in the sector column. So when we extract that grouping, it's going to have 139 rows in that financials group, or that financials data frame in our GroupBy object. Now let's see some additional methods that we can call on our GroupBy object. Again, that's being stored in sectors. So I'll write it out here, and by itself, executing the cell is just going to give us that location in memory. So what we can do here is call a method called first. And what that's going to do is extract the very first row from every single one of those groupings. So we have 21 different sectors, so we're going to see a data frame with 21 different rows. You can see the sector or the grouping is represented to the left here. And what it's done to the right is extract the very first row that it ran into whenever it was creating those groupings. What that meant is, as it was proceeding down through our data frame, every time, the first time rather, it ran into aerospace and defense, it was Boeing, so it captured that row, and so on and so forth for every other sector. I can prove this, in fact, by if I take a look at my first 3 rows of fortune, we can see that retailing is one of our sectors, and Walmart is the very first company on the list that falls under that sector. So if I scroll down to retailing, you can see that Walmart is listed right here. Similarly, if I take the tail method here to take a look at the last 3 rows, here we can see that we have the end of our data set and all these sectors. There is also a complementary method in addition to first, which gives us the first rows. There is a last method, and that's going to return the last row in each grouping that falls under that sector. So for example, we can see here that Wendy's is at the end of our data set and is the last row for the sector hotels, restaurant, and leisure. So if I scroll down to hotels, restaurant, and leisure on my left here in the index, we can see that that Wendy's row is represented here. So what the convenience of the first and last methods is to be able to extract just sample rows from the very top and from the very end of each grouping. That gives us a general sense if you want a visual picture of what our sectors consist of, how long it is, because all that Pandas is returning here is actually its own brand new data frame where the groupings are the index labels, in this case the sectors, and the rows are just the regular rows, in this case 1 for each group. Now there's different ways to retrieve the whole group and specific aspects of each group, but in this case we're just extracting the first or last row from all of our 21 groupings in this big bundled group by object. So I'm going to collapse this by double-clicking here. And now I want to conclude with an attribute that's available on our group by object. Again, that's being stored in the sectors variable. And there is an attribute available called groups. And this is going to operate very interestingly. It's going to give us a dictionary, actually, a Python dictionary. And the keys in the dictionary, you can see the very first one here, aerospace and defense. The keys represent each unique grouping or each unique sector, so there's going to be 21 different keys. And the values represent a list of all of the rows that fall into that grouping. So in this case, these are all the index labels from our original Fortune data frame that fall into our aerospace and defense grouping. And I can prove this by taking this very first number, for example, the 24, and just doing a sample extraction. If I do fortune.loc, and remember this is coming from the rank column, so it's not just the index position, it's a custom label, so I'm using loc instead of iloc. But if I put in 24 here to get that row with a ranking of 24, you'll see that it's Boeing, and it predictably falls in the sector called aerospace and defense. That's why it's showing up here. Similarly, if I take 45, which is the next in line, it's going to give me the next company from our Fortune data frame that's falls into that aerospace and defense sector. So what this is doing, this groups attribute, is giving me a dictionary, and this represents all of the index labels from my original Fortune data frame that are being stored within that grouping, within that sector, aerospace and defense. And if I scroll down and get to my next grouping, which is apparel, you'll see that here are all the rows from our original Fortune data frame that are extracted and make up the apparel sector or the apparel grouping. So predictably, the number of values that you see here, or the number of rows, is going to be the exact same thing as when we call the size method. These are all the rows that make up that grouping. So the groups way is just a really quick way to get a better sense of what falls into your group by object. And again, here in our case, we have a Fortune data frame where our index is numeric, but if we had something like string labels, these strings would show up here instead. And that would basically serve as an indicator of what index string labels fall under each of our groups, or in this case sectors, in that big group by object. So this is just a big picture overview of the object that we get back from the group by method, which is called a data frame group by, and some of the available methods, including size, first, and last, that are available on this grouping, as well as our first attribute, which is the groups attribute, which returns a Python dictionary where the keys are the groupings and the values are the rows inside that grouping. And in the next lesson, we'll start discussing how we can extract one or more of these groupings from this big bundled group by object.